In 1989, the factory gates at Radford Electronics in Bristol finally closed on the original era of its British hi-fi production. Arthur Radford, the engineer whose name had become synonymous with absolute technical precision, was retiring due to failing health, and the company's direct grip on the domestic audio market was ending. The closure did not happen because the equipment was flawed. By the time the Bristol facility ceased its core audio operations, Radford's legendary STA-25 valve amplifiers and highly complex acoustic line loudspeakers were already changing hands among collectors for far more than their original retail prices. Specialist repairers were actively hoarding Radford's bespoke hand-wound transformers, knowing they could not be replicated by modern automated machinery. The original components were not failing. The business model around them was. Skilled British labor, complex cabinet routing, and uncompromising transformer design had simply become mathematically impossible to sustain on a high-street retail shelf that was rapidly being dominated by mass-market imports. A decade earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. The Radford badge on a heavy metal chassis or a carefully veneered timber cabinet had been the ultimate trump card in a specialist dealer's demonstration room. If a listener wanted to hear a pair of quad electrostatic speakers perform at their absolute limit, the dealer reached for a Radford amplifier. The paradox was absolute. The factory in Bristol was stepping away from consumer hi-fi at the exact moment its products were acknowledged by many engineers as the finest ever made in Britain. But the real story of Radford Electronics is not only the story of a closed factory in Bristol. It is the story of a British audio market that praised absolute fidelity, but ultimately rewarded convenience, simpler speaker cabinets, and cheaper silicon. Every week, we tell the stories of British loudspeakers, hi-fi brands, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, voices, and memory. And what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Bristol in 1946. In 1946, the British audio industry was not waiting for Arthur Radford. Bristol was still rebuilding from the devastation of wartime bombing, and Radford Electronics began its life not in a comfortable specialist hi-fi dealer's listenings room, but in the gritty, precise world of industrial electrical engineering. The company wound transformers, heavy, uncompromising magnetic components built for heavy industry, laboratory test equipment, and critical broadcast communications. But in the late 1940s and early 1950s, a new kind of consumer was emerging across Britain. Listeners were returning to their sitting rooms, placing early vinyl records on heavy, rim-driven turntables, and asking for a sound that did not feel as though it was trapped inside a buzzing wooden radio set. They wanted hi-fi, high fidelity, meaning sound reproduction that tries to stay faithful to the original recording. Yet, there was a severe physical barrier between the groove of the record and the air in the room. The valve amplifiers of the era, which used glass vacuum valves to increase the audio signal, were fundamentally restricted by the quality of their output transformers. An output transformer, a heavy block of copper wire meticulously wound around a magnetic iron core, is the crucial bridge in a valve amplifier. It converts the high voltage from the delicate glass valves into a low voltage that can physically push the bass driver of a loudspeaker. If the transformer was built cheaply, the bass became loose and muddy, the mid-range smeared, and the delicate treble details disappeared entirely. In early post-war Britain, most commercial hi-fi transformers were built to a strict price limit to make the amplifiers affordable. They were perfectly adequate for casual background radio listening, but they choked the life out of complex orchestral music or the sharp attack of a jazz drum kit. Arthur Radford, an obsessive engineer who understood magnetics better than almost anyone in the British audio trade, bought contemporary hi-fi amplifiers and tested them on his own Bristol laboratory bench. He found their performance entirely unacceptable. The optimistic specifications printed in the glossy brochures did not match the electrical reality he measured. Rather than write a complaint to the manufacturers, he designed his own solution. Using his deep knowledge of coil winding, he built an output transformer that simply did not saturate, distort, or collapse under a heavy load. He then wrapped a meticulously designed valve amplifier circuit around it, ensuring the signal remained pure from input to output. By the late 1950s, Radford Electronics had moved to a dedicated manufacturing facility on the Ashton Vale estate in Bristol, quietly shifting its immense technical weight from industrial supply into domestic high fidelity. The timing was critical. In 1958, the British market began the shift from mono radio to stereo, requiring listeners to buy 2 loudspeakers and dual-channel amplification to experience the new format. In 1959, Radford released his first commercial hi-fi amplifiers, including the Mono MA15. These were not styled as glamorous luxury goods for a fashionable high street. They looked exactly like what they were: serious, heavy pieces of laboratory equipment painted in industrial finishes, built on thick steel chassis. A Radford amplifier required a sturdy wooden shelf, careful handling, and a deep appreciation for engineering over aesthetics. It was a machine designed for absolute electrical honesty. The British hi-fi press, including the highly demanding reviewers at Hi-Fi News, quickly realized that the Radford amplifiers measured better and sounded cleaner than almost anything else available to the public. But Arthur Radford was not a man to leave a system half-finished. He understood that the electrical perfection of his hand-wound Bristol transformers meant absolutely nothing if the loudspeaker, a device that turns an electrical audio signal into sound moving through air, distorted the final result. In a typical British sitting room of the era, a conventional sealed box, a closed loudspeaker cabinet that uses trapped air behind the bass driver to control its movement, often struggled to produce deep bass without sounding either thin or unnaturally constrained. Radford began designing his own loudspeakers, entirely refusing to accept the acoustic compromises of simple wooden boxes. He explored complex acoustic line designs, creating a highly specific internal architecture where the low-frequency sound from the back of the bass driver was channeled through a folded labyrinth inside the cabinet. This folded path used the moving air to reinforce the bass output smoothly, extending the low frequencies without the artificial, resonant boom of a cheap ported cabinet. It was an incredibly difficult way to build a loudspeaker. It required intricate internal woodwork, thick damping materials, heavy baffles, and highly skilled cabinet makers. When an early Radford acoustic line loudspeaker was placed in a modest British sitting room, positioned carefully and connected to a Radford valve amplifier, the effect was startling. A cello no longer sounded like a dull, vibrating hum. It had physical texture, the scrape of the bow, and a clear, precise position in the stereo image. The illusion that sounds come from places between and around the 2 loudspeakers. This was the retention beat of the company's history. The moment an industrial transformer manufacturer asked British consumers to place massive, uncompromising wooden acoustic labyrinths and heavy, heat-producing valve amplifiers in their domestic spaces. In the early 1960s, a full Radford stereo system was a formidable financial investment, costing the equivalent of several months' wages for an average British worker. Yet, it did not sell on the promise of convenience, visual beauty, or high-street availability. It sold purely on the absolute, terrifying authority of its sound. The brand began to infiltrate the highest tier of the British hi-fi landscape. These were not loud, busy department stores. They were specialist dealers, quiet, carpeted demonstration rooms where careful salesmen guided affluent buyers through the ritual of component matching. In these hushed rooms, the Radford Amplifier and its accompanying loudspeakers quickly became the ultimate reference standard. The engineering was undeniable. Now, it had to survive the brutal judgment of the British hi-fi dealer network. In 1965, Radford released the amplifier that would cement its reputation forever, the STA-25. Paired with Radford's newly refined acoustic line loudspeakers, such as the studio and the auditorium models, the system represented a brutal rejection of mass-market compromise. To understand why this equipment captured the British audio imagination, one must look at what it physically brought into the room. To encounter an STA-25 on a specialist dealer's shelf was to look at a machine built for purpose, not for domestic decoration. It was a heavy, ventilated metal cage sitting over glowing glass vacuum valves and massive, imposing transformer blocks painted in military-grade gray or black. Valve amplifier, an amplifier using glass valves to increase an audio signal, mattered because it fundamentally changed how a loudspeaker behaved at ordinary sitting room volume. Unlike early solid-state transistor designs that often sounded brittle or harsh when pushed, the STA-25 delivered power with an absolute, unshakable grip on the loudspeaker's bass driver. But the amplifier was only half the equation. The Radford acoustic line loudspeaker was a physical monolith, designed to defeat the limitations of standard wooden boxes. Standing tall in carefully matched wood veneer, a thin layer of attractive wood used on the outside of a loudspeaker cabinet, it was astonishingly heavy, requiring two people to position it properly in a sitting room. Inside the cabinet, Arthur Radford had perfected the acoustic labyrinth. Acoustic line, a highly complex internal folded path that uses the rear energy of the bass driver to smoothly reinforce low frequencies, mattered because it solved the greatest problem in British domestic audio. When a listener sat in a modest sitting room and played a jazz record, a cheap ported cabinet made the double bass boom aggressively, smearing the notes together. The Radford acoustic line, packed with dense internal damping material to control resonance, made the instrument sound like real wood and vibrating string. It anchored the bass firmly in the room, extending the low frequencies without distortion. The crossover, an electrical network inside a loudspeaker that sends bass, mid-range, and treble to the drivers designed to handle them, was built with the same obsessive precision as the amplifiers, ensuring the transition from a deep drum strike to a high female vocal was entirely seamless. This combination created an audio moat that competitors simply could not cross. When a specialist hi-fi dealer in London, Bristol, or Yorkshire connected a Garrard 301 turntable to a Radford SC22 preamplifier, fed the signal into the STA-25 power amplifier, and drove a pair of Radford studio loudspeakers, the stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around two loudspeakers, was terrifyingly precise. The singer was not trapped inside a vibrating wooden box. The voice stood independently in the center of the room, surrounded by an undeniable sense of physical space. Competitors dismantled Radford amplifiers on their test benches to discover the secret. What they found was a manufacturing reality that was impossible to mass-produce cheaply. The magic was not in a patented circuit trick. It was in the physical reality of the output transformers, hand-wound in Bristol, with proprietary techniques that prevented magnetic saturation even at thunderous volumes. To copy a Radford amplifier meant spending the exact same amount of money on heavy copper wire, premium iron cores, and skilled British factory labor, which instantly destroyed the profit margins of commercial rivals. This level of uncompromising engineering required a serious financial sacrifice from the listener. In the mid-1960s, a Radford STA-25, paired with its preamplifier and a set of acoustic line loudspeakers, could easily cost upwards of $150 to $200. At a time when the average British weekly wage was roughly £9 and a standard high street radiogram could be bought for $40, purchasing a Radford system was not a casual domestic acquisition. It was the financial equivalent of buying a reliable second-hand car. A buyer did not encounter this equipment in a crowded, noisy department store. They found it in specialist hi-fi dealers, quiet, dedicated demonstration rooms where audio was treated with religious reverence, and where careful salesmen guided affluent listeners through the ritual of critical evaluation. The British audio establishment quickly capitulated to the Bristol factory's standards. The rigorous reviewers at Hi-Fi News and Gramophone magazine, who routinely exposed the exaggerated claims of lesser brands, measured the STA-25 and found that its distortion figures were actually lower than Radford's own conservative published specifications. Independent recording studios, demanding a truthful representation of their master tapes, installed Radford amplification to drive their studio monitors, loudspeakers used in studios to reveal details clearly during mixing and mastering. Even BBC technicians, working within strict broadcast requirements, acknowledged that the Bristol transformers provided an incredibly neutral, uncolored power source for evaluating speech and classical music. High-end retailers across Britain used Radford equipment not just to sell Radford, but as their ultimate reference tool to demonstrate the true capability of any turntable or loudspeaker in the showroom. The breakthrough reached its ultimate cultural peak when the STA-25 became the de facto reference standard for driving the notoriously difficult Quad ESL57. The Quad was an electrostatic speaker, a design that used a thin, electrically charged membrane instead of traditional cones to produce sound, and it presented a highly unstable electrical load that could easily provoke a lesser amplifier into failure. The Radford STA-25, with its massive, unflappable Bristol transformers, drove the Quads with supreme authority. Together, the Quad electrostatic speaker and the Radford valve amplifier became the holy grail of the British stereo system, a combination that specialist dealers spoke of with genuine awe. The badge on the amplifier and the grille of the loudspeaker was not decoration. It was a promise about sound. A promise that was about to reach the absolute peak of British hi-fi. By the close of the 1960s, Radford Electronics was no longer merely a respected engineering firm operating on the Ashton Vale estate in Bristol. It had become the absolute summit of the British audio landscape. To understand the scale of Arthur Radford's achievement, one must look at the highly critical, demanding network of listening spaces that adopted his equipment as their ultimate reference standard. Bristol built the transformers. The BBC trusted the power. Independent recording studios relied on the honesty. Specialist dealers used the amplifiers to sell the dream. British sitting rooms made the dream a physical reality. At its peak, the Radford badge was not merely a consumer electronics logo, it was an industrial guarantee. The equipment was installed in acoustic testing laboratories across Britain, not to play music, but because laboratory technicians needed a power source that produced zero measurable distortion of its own. When the British hi-fi press, including the rigorous technical writers at Hi-Fi News, needed to evaluate a new, highly inefficient loudspeaker, a device that turns an electrical audio signal into sound moving through air, they routinely connected it to a Radford STA-25. If a speaker sounded poor when driven by a Radford, the reviewers concluded the fault lay entirely with the loudspeaker. The amplifier was beyond suspicion. Yet, this immense cultural and technical prestige created an immediate manufacturing paradox. As the dealer network expanded across London, Yorkshire, and Edinburgh, the demand for Radford valve amplifiers and acoustic line loudspeakers surged. But the factory in Bristol was not a mass-production assembly line, and it structurally refused to behave like one. The core of the Radford magic remained the output transformer, a heavy block of copper wire meticulously wound around a magnetic iron core. This component could not be rushed. It could not be outsourced to a cheaper overseas facility. It required highly skilled British labor, exact tensioning, and proprietary winding techniques that Arthur Radford personally oversaw. Consequently, affluent British buyers did not simply walk into a high-street audio shop and walk out with a Radford system. They joined a waiting list. They placed a deposit with a specialist dealer and waited for the Ashton Vale factory to finish building their specific unit by hand. The loudspeakers presented an even greater logistical challenge. The Radford studio and auditorium models were enormous, heavy pieces of furniture. Their acoustic line cabinets, a highly complex internal folded path that uses the rear energy of the bass driver to smoothly reinforce low frequencies, required massive amounts of dense timber, internal baffling, and careful veneering. Moving them from the cabinet shop in Bristol to a specialist hi-fi dealer in London, and finally into a domestic British sitting room, was a physically exhausting, expensive process. A pair of these loudspeakers dominated whatever room they were placed in. But the physical imposition was entirely forgiven the moment the system was turned on. In a modest, carpeted British sitting room, where a cheaper, mass-market stereo system turned a complex orchestral crescendo into a harsh, congested blur, a Radford amplifier driving a pair of Radford acoustic line loudspeakers did something terrifyingly simple. It removed the physical boundaries of the room. It separated the violins from the cellos, gave the kettle drum a physical strike that could be felt in the floorboards, and anchored the human voice perfectly in the center of the stereo image. The listener was no longer hearing a pair of vibrating wooden boxes. They were hearing the original recording venue, reconstructed in mid-air. This was the cultural peak of the British stereo system. At a time when mass-market radiograms and cheap, imported music centers were beginning to flood the high street, offering convenience and low prices, Radford represented the uncompromising alternative. It was a listening culture that believed absolute fidelity was worth the cost, the wait, and the physical weight. The Bristol factory was running at its absolute maximum capacity, fulfilling orders for the domestic market and exporting its heavy, gray-painted amplifiers to discerning audiophiles across the globe. The specialist hi-fi dealers were entirely dependent on the Radford name to demonstrate the true capability of the premium record decks and electrostatic panels they sold. Arthur Radford had successfully forced the British audio market to meet his uncompromising engineering standards. But maintaining that peak required the company to scale a bespoke, hand-built manufacturing process, a mathematical impossibility that was about to collide with a radically changing world. To walk into the Ashton Vale factory at the height of Radford's influence in the late 1960s was to witness a manufacturing anomaly. While other British consumer electronics companies were beginning to experiment with automated assembly lines and cheaper printed circuit boards to meet the booming high-street demand, Arthur Radford's facility looked more like a precision laboratory crossed with a heavy industrial workshop. The company employed around 160 skilled workers at its peak, an astonishing number for a specialist audio manufacturer, yet every amplifier and loudspeaker was treated as a bespoke instrument. The transformers were still hand-wound, layer by layer, with paper insulation carefully inserted between the copper coils. The loudspeaker cabinets still required expert British carpenters to route the complex internal timber baffles of the acoustic line, a highly complex internal folded path that uses the rear energy of the bass driver to smoothly reinforce low frequencies. The peak metric of Radford's success was not measured in millions of units sold, but in the absolute monopoly it held over the high-end British listening room. By the early 1970s, it is estimated that the majority of serious British audio dealers who stocked the notoriously difficult quad electrostatic loudspeaker refused to demonstrate it with anything other than a Radford ST225. The brand had achieved the rarest status in the British audio market. It was no longer judged against its competitors. It was the standard by which its competitors were judged. In the specialist hi-fi shops of London's Tottenham Court Road, a street rapidly becoming the epicenter of British audio retail, a Radford system in the window signaled that the dealer catered to the absolute elite. The cultural reach of the equipment extended far beyond the affluent audiophile. Independent recording studios, striving to capture the raw energy of the British rock and jazz explosions, purchased Radford amplifiers to ensure their playback was unflinchingly accurate. The BBC, an organization that demanded the highest possible fidelity for its broadcast monitoring, utilized Radford transformers and amplification circuits in their acoustic evaluation rooms. Even in the highly demanding export market, American and European buyers paid exorbitant shipping costs to have the heavy, gray Bristol metalwork delivered to their homes, knowing that no domestic manufacturer offered the same combination of unbreakable magnetic stability and acoustic refinement. Radford's product lines expanded to include the monitor and studio loudspeakers, each iteration pushing the boundaries of what a massive wooden box could achieve in a domestic space. In its ultimate domestic setting, the Radford system was a commanding physical presence. In a dimly lit, carefully arranged British sitting room, a Radford SC22 pre-amplifier and STA25 power amplifier typically sat on a reinforced wooden rack, glowing with the gentle heat of glass valves, alongside a premium Garrard or Thorens turntable. At the edges of the room stood the massive Radford acoustic line loudspeakers, their thick wood veneer gleaming quietly. The system required patience to turn on, care to operate, and physical space to breathe. But when the needle dropped into the groove of a well-pressed record, the physical equipment vanished. The bass driver, a larger driver designed to reproduce low frequencies, moved with absolute control, pushing the double bass into the room without a hint of cabinet resonance. The singer stood vividly in the center, uncolored by cheap transformers or vibrating wooden panels. The crossover, an electrical network inside a loudspeaker that sends bass, mid-range, and treble to the drivers designed to handle them, was so precisely calibrated that the transition from a deep drum strike to a high cymbal crash felt entirely seamless. For a brief, glorious period, Arthur Radford had proved that the British audio market would support absolute, uncompromising engineering. He had forced the specialist dealers to respect the physical weight of his transformers, and he had convinced a generation of listeners that true fidelity required a serious financial and spatial sacrifice. Radford had conquered the listening room, but outside that room, the economics of British hi-fi were quietly preparing to change the rules of survival. In the early 1970s, a subtle but irreversible shift occurred on the shelves of the British specialist hi-fi dealer. For a decade, the massive gray-painted Radford STA25 had occupied the place of honor in the primary demonstration room, trusted by dealers to sell their most expensive electrostatic panels and premium record decks. But slowly, the heavy Bristol metalwork was being quietly moved to the back shelves. In its place, sitting prominently in the shop window, was a new kind of machine, a sleek, brushed aluminium receiver imported from Japan. It was lighter, it ran completely cool, it lit up with bright fluorescent displays, and crucially, it was significantly cheaper. The first crack in the Radford empire was not a failure of sound. It was the arrival of the solid-state transistor, a technological shift that fundamentally changed the economics of British hi-fi. A solid-state amplifier, an amplifier that uses small silicon transistors instead of glowing glass vacuum valves to increase the audio signal, did not require massive, hand-wound output transformers to function. The silicon components could be soldered quickly onto cheap printed circuit boards by automated assembly lines in overseas factories. For Arthur Radford, this was a systemic disaster. The entire foundation of the company's audio supremacy, the unbreachable engineering moat that protected its reputation, was built on the output transformer. The Ashton Vale factory in Bristol still employed highly skilled British workers to wind heavy copper wire over premium iron cores, layer by layer, carefully inserting paper insulation by hand. It was a beautiful, mathematically perfect way to build an audio component, but it was structurally incompatible with the new global retail reality. The Japanese imports bypassed the transformer entirely. A high street buyer in London or Edinburgh could now purchase a complete, glittering hi-fi separate system, integrated amplifier, tuner, and cassette deck for the price of a single Radford preamplifier. The loudspeakers faced a parallel, equally devastating economic assault. In the inflation-battered British economy of the 1970s, the raw materials required for an acoustic line cabinet became prohibitively expensive. The heavy, dense timber, the premium wood veneer, and the highly skilled cabinet makers needed to root the complex internal labyrinths drove the retail price of a Radford studio loudspeaker to astronomical levels. Mass-market competitors were rapidly abandoning complex internal acoustics, shifting production to simple, sealed or ported boxes made from cheap, thin chipboard. The cheaper speaker did not need to image perfectly. It did not need to control the bass driver with absolute, unflappable authority. It only needed to sound good enough in a British sitting room, where the buyer no longer wanted massive, heavy wooden monoliths dominating the floor space. The culture of listening was changing. A new generation of buyers wanted convenience, neatness, and affordability over absolute, uncompromising fidelity. The heavy, heat-producing valve amplifier and the monolithic acoustic line loudspeaker began to look less like engineering triumphs and more like old-fashioned, cumbersome relics of a bygone era. Radford attempted to adapt to the shifting ground. Recognizing that the valve era was receding from the mainstream high street, the company designed its own solid-state equipment, releasing models such as the ZD22 preamplifier and the HD250 integrated amplifier. Arthur Radford applied his obsessive Bristol engineering standards to the silicon era, ensuring the new circuits measured exceptionally well and delivered vanishingly low distortion figures. But the market logic had fundamentally changed, and the Bristol factory was now fighting a war it could not win. Radford was no longer competing against other bespoke British workshops, where sound quality was the only metric that mattered. It was competing against global consumer electronics giants with massive economies of scale, vast advertising budgets, and highly efficient overseas supply chains. When a buyer read a hi-fi magazine review, the imported solid-state amplifiers boasted enormous on-paper wattage figures that obscured the harshness of their actual sound. The specialist dealer, who once relied on the STA-25 to prove the value of high-fidelity audio, was now under immense pressure to stock the cheaper, high-margin imported boxes that were flying out of the shop doors. The equipment still worked flawlessly. The original amplifiers still measured perfectly on the laboratory test bench. But the listening room that demanded them, and the specialist retail network that understood how to sell them, was slowly being dismantled. The uncompromising engineering had survived the transition to stereo, but it was beginning to buckle under the weight of its own manufacturing costs. Arthur Radford's health was failing, and the factory that bore his name was about to face the ultimate consequence of building things too well for a market that only wanted things to be good enough. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the decline of the traditional British listening room was accelerating. The specialist hi-fi dealer, a quiet, carpeted space where careful salesmen guided affluent listeners through the ritual of component matching, was under siege. In its place came the modern high-street electronics retailer, a business model built on moving high volumes of stock as quickly as possible. Floor space in a London or Manchester retail shop became astronomically expensive. A dealer could no longer afford to dedicate prime demonstration space to a massive pair of Radford acoustic line loudspeakers that might take 6 months to sell, especially when they could stack 10 pairs of cheap, imported vinyl-wrapped bookshelf speakers in the exact same footprint. The physical reality of the Radford loudspeaker had become a commercial liability. The acoustic line, a highly complex internal folded path that uses the rear energy of the bass driver to smoothly reinforce low frequencies, was a masterpiece of acoustic engineering. But it was a nightmare for retail logistics. The cabinets were heavy, difficult to transport, and visually dominating in a British sitting room that was increasingly being rearranged around a new focal point: the color television. As the television claimed the center of the room, the space available for proper stereo imaging, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around two loudspeakers, began to shrink. The market no longer wanted a wooden monolith. Inside the Ashton Vale factory in Bristol, the financial pressure was becoming unbearable. The core of Radford's reputation, the hand-wound output transformer, remained as brilliant as ever, but the raw materials were rapidly increasing in price. The cost of premium copper wire and specialized magnetic iron, combined with the rising wages of skilled British labor, made the traditional manufacturing process financially unsustainable against the flood of cheap silicon. When a buyer walked into a shop, they saw a solid-state amplifier that promised 100 watts of power for a fraction of the cost of a 30-watt Radford valve amplifier. The fact that the Radford's 30 watts were delivered with absolute stability and zero magnetic saturation mattered only to a shrinking circle of purists. The mass market had decided that convenience and a low price tag were more important than absolute fidelity. Arthur Radford's health was also beginning to fail. The obsessive engineer who had personally overseen the winding tension of the copper wire and the acoustic damping of the labyrinth cabinets could no longer drive the company with his former relentless energy. In an attempt to survive the transition into the 1980s, the company tried to adapt. They released updated versions of their valve amplifiers, such as the TT100, recognizing that a small, dedicated audiophile market still craved the absolute linearity that solid-state equipment struggled to provide. But the scale of the operation was inevitably contracting. The grand era of supplying massive gray-painted metalwork to recording studios and acoustic laboratories had passed. The studios were moving to active studio monitors, loudspeakers with built-in solid-state amplification and active crossovers, which eliminated the need for heavy external valve amplifiers altogether. The loudspeaker division suffered even more quickly, as the original foam surrounds, the flexible ring around a bass driver cone that lets it move in and out, began to degrade on older Radford models. Many listeners simply threw the massive cabinets away rather than seeking out a specialist refoaming service. The culture of repair was being replaced by a culture of replacement. Why pay a cabinet maker and a technician to restore a heavy acoustic line speaker when a local high-street shop was selling lightweight, mass-produced Japanese boxes at a heavy discount? The British audio market, once fiercely loyal to domestic engineering, was voting with its wallet. The final devastating blow to the old British hi-fi hierarchy was the arrival of the compact disc. When digital audio emerged in the early 1980s, the industry marketing machine declared that analog distortion was completely cured. The CD player was marketed as perfect sound forever, and consumers were told they only needed a sleek, modern amplifier to hear it. The traditional valve amplifier, with its glowing glass tubes, heat generation, and heavy iron transformers, was portrayed in the mainstream audio press as an outdated anachronism. A whole generation of buyers completely bypassed the ritual of valve amplification and acoustic line cabinets, opting instead for integrated solid-state systems that fitted neatly onto a shallow glass shelf. In 1989, the inevitable finally happened. Arthur Radford's deteriorating health forced him to step away from the business he had built, from a post-war transformer winding operation into a global audio reference standard. The original Radford Electronics company ceased its primary British hi-fi production. When the Ashton Vale operations wound down, it was not just a brand name that shifted. It was the loss of highly specific British industrial knowledge. The men and women who knew exactly how to layer paper insulation between copper windings to prevent high-frequency loss were no longer required by a market that preferred printed circuit boards. The physical workshop disappeared. The rights and manufacturing responsibilities for the classic valve amplifiers were transferred to Woodside Electronics, a company formed by former Radford employees who desperately wanted to keep the legendary circuit designs alive. Woodside continued to produce excellent equipment in Britain, meticulously building amplifiers that honored the original Bristol specifications. But the scale had fundamentally changed. It was no longer an empire dictating the standards of the British audio market. It was a boutique heritage operation serving a niche group of collectors. The massive acoustic line loudspeakers, which required extensive woodwork and physical space, were quietly abandoned. The British listening room had moved on. The high street had moved on. The era of the heavy, uncompromising, hand-built Bristol audio machine was over. The transition was complete. The dealer network collapsed. The high street pushed them out. The cabinet shop went quiet. The original factory gates closed. The television took the room. The silicon replaced the valve. The factory gates closed, and the original company was gone. But the market soon discovered that replacing Arthur Radford's sound was much harder than replacing his company. The Radford name did not entirely vanish from the British audio landscape, but the uncompromising empire that Arthur Radford built in Bristol was fundamentally disassembled. Woodside Electronics, formed by dedicated former employees, valiantly kept the valve amplifier circuits alive for a time, ensuring that the legendary STA-25 design did not disappear completely into the archives. Yet, the scale of production had irrevocably contracted. The ambitious monolithic acoustic line loudspeakers, devices that turned electrical audio signals into sound, moving through air via incredibly complex folded internal paths, were permanently abandoned. The intricate wooden labyrinths that made the Radford studio such a formidable presence in the 1960s could not be resurrected. The cost of domestic British carpentry had simply risen too high to make such massive cabinets commercially viable again. Today, the Radford badge survives only as a highly revered boutique heritage name, occasionally attached to limited-run revivals. The mainstream British high street hi-fi shop has completely forgotten them. The silence of their mass-market absence is the true measure of how drastically the industry changed. But within the specialist vintage audio community, the name still commands absolute, almost intimidating respect. The original equipment is kept fiercely alive by a dedicated network of British preservationists, retired dealers, and specialist repair technicians. Retired hi-fi dealers, men who once used the STA-25 to demonstrate the true capability of the finest record decks, still speak of the Bristol equipment with a hushed, reverent tone. On enthusiast platforms like Pinkfish Media and Hi-Fi Wigwam, the appearance of an original unmodified Radford STA-25 power amplifier or SC22 preamplifier instantly commands attention. Collectors scour eBay and Facebook Marketplace, hunting not for modern convenience, but for heavy, gray-painted metalwork. The culture of recapping, replacing old capacitors in a crossover or amplifier circuit to restore or stabilize performance, is painstakingly applied to these machines. Technicians actively hoard original Bristol transformers, knowing they are strictly irreplaceable. While the massive loudspeakers are rarer, those that survive are treated with extreme reverence. Their degraded foam surrounds, the flexible ring around a bass driver cone that lets it move in and out, carefully repaired by specialists who refuse to let the original acoustic labyrinth go to waste. This intense preservation effort is not driven by blind nostalgia. It is driven by a stark, functional reality. Arthur Radford's original hand-wound output transformers remain incredibly difficult, if not mathematically impossible, to beat at any reasonable price point. An old British valve amplifier with a solid, original Bristol transformer, restored by careful hands, can still do what a cheap, modern, mass-produced silicon amplifier often cannot. It provides a physical grip on the bass driver, the moving part of a loudspeaker that pushes air to create low frequencies, that prevents the music from sounding thin or detached. It can take a notoriously difficult load, like a vintage quad electrostatic panel, and drive it with absolute, unshakable authority. It anchors a recording firmly in the room. Not because it is old, but because it relies on the uncompromising physical laws of heavy copper, premium iron, and magnetic stability, laws that automated overseas factories frequently try to cheat. The physical landscape where this uncompromising standard was born has long since moved on. At the Ashton Vale estate in Bristol, the specific industrial environment that allowed Arthur Radford to transition from heavy industrial transformers to the pinnacle of domestic high fidelity is unrecognizable from its 1960s peak. Where highly skilled British technicians once carefully layered paper insulation between copper coils, there are now modern, generic commercial units, distribution warehouses, and light industrial spaces. The heavy winding machinery is gone. The cabinet shop that routed the dense timber labyrinths is only a memory. There is no blue plaque to mark the exact spot where the British stereo system reached its electrical zenith. There is only the quiet, continuous churn of modern business. Yet the engineering legacy carries a strange, enduring irony. Today, when modern boutique audio designers attempt to build the ultimate high-end valve amplifiers, often charging tens of thousands of pounds, they routinely place original Radford transformers onto their test benches. They dismantle them, measure them, and attempt to reverse engineer the precise winding techniques that a Bristol factory perfected over half a century ago. The modern luxury market is desperately trying to replicate the exact same magnetic honesty that the British high street discarded for being too heavy and too expensive. The story of Radford Electronics reveals a profound contradiction in how Britain builds, sells, and discards sound. It highlights the vast gap between what the culture claims to value, engineering restraint, repairability, honest voicing, and absolute fidelity, and what the commercial market ultimately rewards. It is a story of an industry that perfected the physical art of sound reproduction, only to realize that the modern buyer preferred the illusion of progress to the reality of physical weight. When faced with the choice between a heavy, uncompromising machine that told the absolute truth and a cheap, convenient box that offered a good enough approximation, the retail system chose convenience. The market praised the genius of Arthur Radford, but it simply could not afford to sustain him. But the sound he built has not been completely silenced. Somewhere, sitting quietly on a reinforced wooden rack in a British sitting room, an original gray-painted amplifier is warming up, its glass valves glowing softly in the dim light, its massive transformers waiting to take absolute control of the loudspeakers, ready to anchor a human voice perfectly in the air for just one more record. See you in the next one.